Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a Champions League video, and maybe this is actually more fitting to be UCL Fran. But we're back with some Champions League content. We haven't done it for a few years, but I'm excited to actually do some content, and I do really want to know your opinions on whether you want to see some of the content. Right now, we're planning to do some Champions League content for Matchday 1. I am potentially planning to maybe open up a new channel if it makes sense. If you're an FPL player, you don't want to see this content, feel free to let me know your thoughts. I'm totally receptive to it. I don't mind maybe opening up a new channel if that's a better space to maybe have a UCL podcast as well, to have some more detailed thoughts into Champions League, seeing as I personally myself watch a lot of European football, but I also understand that a lot of people just follow Premier League and they want to stick to the Premier League, and that's totally fine. In fact, I mean, I spend most of my weekends watching Premier League football as opposed to some of the other leagues. I can end up catching up on a lot of leagues and then also watch Real Madrid, but that's pretty much my sort of European flavor. I tend to follow all the leagues because I play Champions League football myself. And sorry, not Champions League football on the pitch, but Champions League fantasy, and have always been doing so for the last few years. So that's just something I wanted to mention from the outset. Do let me know what your thoughts are. Happy to continue doing content here. It could be members only content as well, if that makes a bit more sense in terms of visuals. But what I wanted to do is almost incorporate a little bit more data insight into Champions League football. I think a lot of people, obviously, you can use the eye test. I watch a lot of European football, but I think at the end of the day, there's an extreme difficulty in being able to marry up more than 10 leagues within Europe. And trying to be honest with yourself in terms of trying to evaluate the leagues. I think data can help you sort of bridge that approach. What do I mean by that as an example? So I think when you look at, for example, Matchday 1 here, and you look at these team projections, you'll notice that these team projections are actually provided by my friend FPL Shadden. We run an FPL podcast together called the FPL Script. So feel free to subscribe there. We do analytics-y podcasts, if that's something that interests you, if you want data insights, if you want to kind of get a bit of that side of the game into your field and have a look at it. But what I'm talking about here is we've got Sporting versus Kairat, right? A team that we haven't necessarily seen within the Champions League much before. They just made it through the playoffs by actually beating Celtic, if I believe I'm correct. And ultimately, Celtic, for example, are also a team that historically we would have targeted a lot within Champions League. And so even though we might not hold the Portuguese league in extremely high regard, this is still a window, as per the bookies, where actually Sporting end up being one of the teams that have the best expected goals for just Matchday 1. So in terms of strategy, I know a lot of people are actually considering doing some things like, for example, maybe targeting a PSG in Matchday 1 and going for a wildcard 2, targeting Benfica alongside that, Sporting FC alongside that, even considering Eintracht Frankfurt. Whereas all the other top teams also have some pretty good matches, but not to the same sort of standard, right? So I can understand the approach of the wildcard 2 strategy, and this data visualization actually gives you the ability to almost plan your strategy. Also think about something that you might have missed, right? You're not going to be able to track more than, I guess, 7 to 8 leagues at a time. So the opportunity to maybe actually see, okay, big picture, what are the teams that I'm missing? What are the players that I'm missing potentially? Because they could be at extremely cheap price points. And I go back to Sporting as an example. I think the most broken pick in the game right now is Luis Suarez from Sporting. That might just be simply because he just has an amazing Matchday 1. But if you think about it, accumulate the goals that Sporting have between Matchday 1 and Matchday 3. That's more than Newcastle, right? And do you need to spend more money to get at Newcastle players who provide you similar, I guess, expected goal share? Absolutely, you do. So that's why I think it's quite interesting to use data to kind of visualize and provide some insights. As I said, some people are planning a wildcard 2. I myself, when I look at this big picture, I would say I would consider a later wildcard still. I kind of like having that in the bank. You get a lot of free transfers in Champions League fantasy anyways, 2 free transfers per week. You can only roll 1 free transfer at a time. And I think there's really good fixtures for the top teams anyways, where you don't really necessarily need to just go straight into a wildcard 2 strategy. My thoughts actually, when I look at this visualization, and I have to say, once again, shout out to my friend FPL Shadden, a great friend of mine, someone who models for international football as well. But you can find his own projected points model on patreon.com/UCL Fantasy. This is not an ad. I might even do a podcast with him, a Champions League podcast with him in the future. So, look forward to more content and let me know if you want to see more of this. But when I look at this big picture, right, or as Praz likes to call it with his umbrella view, I guess, or helicopter view rather, I look at things like Matchday 5 as a really good window to actually consider a limitless. Why do I say that? If I'm going to start the season with Barcelona, if I'm going to start the season with Bayern Munich, if I'm going to start the season with Tottenham, if I'm going to start the season with, let's say, Inter Milan, this is a great window to jump into a lot of fixtures that my team would not be well suited to, right? At the same time, I might not start the season with Liverpool, right? I don't really know which Liverpool players to pick right now. Sure, there's Gakpo. Sure, there's Virgil van Dijk, who I think is very consistent. But at the same time, we're looking at someone like Salah, and maybe we have a little bit of distrust from him. Maybe this is coming from a Premier League point of view. I'm sure a lot of people are fully okay with going Salah in UCL Fantasy. He's one of the greatest UCL Fantasy players we've seen. But I think if you're seeing, for example, some of the things that we're seeing within the Premier League, you might be a little bit cold on Liverpool, and you might distrust some of these sort of model numbers. But I think if you're going to take that view, then Matchday 5 Limitless makes even more sense. You wouldn't have started with Liverpool players. You're going into more Liverpool players in Matchday 5 in a better game. Same with PSG. They've got so many injuries. Dembele's out, Doué's out, Kvaratskhelia just got an injury. Barcola is probably the only serious pick that I think I would go with in Matchday 1. And simply put, you might actually just want to ignore PSG altogether. Even Hakimi, if the team's going to be that much weaker, I personally think that that's going to have a small impact in Matchday 1, even though the fixture looks that good on paper. So why not revisit them in Matchday 5 with a Limitless? Because the next few games aren't any better. Same thing with Napoli. They start with City first. You might not actually want to invest into any Napoli players from the offensive point of view. You might actually have started the season with some Napoli players on defense. Here's a good opportunity to actually move into Napoli players on offense and take that into account. Copenhagen as well, way at the bottom of this list, but I'd definitely be considering them for a Matchday 5 Limitless. So that's my strategy. First of all, I look at a window like that. I think 5 and 6 look like the most odd windows where the big teams actually have some pretty tough games. You know, ultimately Matchday 4 is a pretty tough game as well, right? Bayern Munich and Real Madrid have a tough fixture. And when you look at, for example, Inter Milan, it's still a great game. So probably, I think the thing to think about here is, okay, if I started with Real Madrid and Bayern Munich players, maybe I could have sold them. Just bank in the great fixtures for Matchday 1 and 3 for those teams. And then suddenly jump off of Bayern Munich. And I can probably actually make my team run all the way towards a Matchday 7 wildcard or maybe a Matchday 6 wildcard. And it really just depends on whether I think your team is on track, right? If you didn't start with Liverpool players, Matchday 7 wildcard actually kind of makes sense. If you actually kept the Bayern Munich players, then Matchday 7 wildcard also makes sense. At the same time, if you get towards Matchday 6 and you, let's say, maybe, I don't know, got rid of your Bayern Munich players, your Real Madrid players, maybe your Tottenham players as well, it could be a good time to just reconsider the wildcard because you're jumping back into some nice Barcelona fixtures, nice Bayern Munich fixtures, maybe even a chance to jump into City, right? A little bit of an odd window, but it just depends, right? I think 6 or 7 is going to be my wildcard target. I will basically just have a look at my team at that point in time and just reconsider whether I actually want to be investing into different teams. Matchday 8 is always a tricky one where I think that ultimately just comes down to where is everyone positioned within the league table and do they need to rotate? Can they rotate? Because so many teams within the top European leagues are still so actively competing within their own domestic leagues that they will rotate whenever they get given the chance. Liverpool versus PSG, or PSV rather, was a perfect example of that last year where you could see them rotating for sure and that hurt them ultimately. So I think that's what I wanted to mention in terms of chip strategy. I look at something like this and I think in terms of attack, that's kind of the chip strategy I'd have. So let's move on away from attack and let's look at defense. So with defense, I would say clean sheets is probably similar to what we looked at, but what are the teams here that are a little bit better? I would say Arsenal, absolutely. And it makes sense, right? This is, you know, the tank commander team. This is what they play for. And their attack hasn't been too bad this season, but I think where they are the cream of the crop is on defense. Same with Napoli too. So Matchday 1 doesn't look great, but unfortunately Murray is injured as well with the goalkeeping situation, and that does rob us of a 4 million goalkeeper, but you know, that suggests actually they could make a lot of sense Matchday 2 going forward. So once again, one of the teams to look at for a wildcard 2 strategy. Liverpool just seemed really consistent. Bayern Munich seemed really consistent, both in attack and defense. Chelsea, I think, have looked really strong, but do keep in mind, of course, they do have a tough Matchday 1 and 5 fixture. So maybe it's a case of, if you're thinking about, let's say, transfers and we go back to maybe attack, Chelsea's one of those teams where if you don't go for a wildcard 2 strategy, maybe plan to book some transfers into these Chelsea players, right? Because you can actually gain to benefit or stand to benefit a lot. With Inter Milan, I think you just have to think that their first 4 fixtures are amazing. They've always been very defensively minded. Obviously, they're under Chivu now, but not too much has changed. I think Dumfries is still great. And yeah, why not look at a team like this? And when I talk about something like this too, I think PSG is very low, right? So maybe don't consider Hakimi necessarily. I know he's one of the most popular picks in the game and he was the best attacker in defense last year. But this is, to me, looks like an opportunity where I would consider going against. It could be stupid, but I like taking my risks against highly owned players if I feel like there's an opportunity to do so. City, not too high. Atleti, not too high. Real Madrid, interestingly, once again, a case of really good fixtures at the start. So maybe consider starting with Real Madrid and then shifting off of them. Sporting, Benfica, you can kind of see that in Matchday 1. They have a really good game. Nothing too spectacular, but at the same time, keep in mind that clean sheets are not the only thing that drives defender points, right? We know attacking fullbacks get points, sure, but it's also about ball recoveries in UCL. Ball recoveries in Champions League Fantasy tend to always give you a lot of opportunities to get a lot of points. And so center backs have always provided a lot of value within the game. Sure, you might actually still see, as I said, Hakimi and Nuno Mendes as, let's say, the top scoring defenders, but that's also because that team is specific, where I don't think you have a pair of collective two fullbacks that are as offensive anyways, right, across Europe. And so is that really a good point of comparison? Absolutely not. So I think when you look at actually most of the sort of high points earners within Champions League Fantasy in recent years, I would say our center backs who can get you ball recoveries and also, generally speaking, be a good set piece threat too. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. There's obviously some exceptions. Arsenal, for example, Calafiori, Timber, these are interesting players too to consider if you really want to sort of cheese, I guess, the pricing system. So that's kind of my thoughts in terms of clean sheets. Now, one other visual I wanted to kind of round off with, and once again, this is provided by FPL Shadon. You can find his model, as I said, in the link in the description below, patreon.com/UCL Fantasy. Trust a lot of his data, but this is Matchday 1 projected data. So in terms of teams to target, if you really want to do that wildcard 2 strategy, or you want to do a bit of a mix, right? I'm probably going to pursue a bit of a mix. I think there's a lot of value in still getting as much points as possible on the board, and then shifting some of these players, because you have more free transfers in Champions League Fantasy than you do, for example, with a game like Premier League Fantasy, where you're only getting 1 free transfer a week. Here you get 2 free transfers a week, and you can roll 1 out of the 2. So for me, I think when I look at this, I think Sporting Lisbon, great team to target. Benfica, great team to target. But then it becomes a lot of the teams that we're used to, right? Real Madrid, PSG, Bayern Munich, Liverpool. But keep in mind, when we go back to that previous visual, I don't think necessarily going too deep into PSG makes too much sense. Liverpool could. Olympiacos is definitely just a Matchday 1 pun. City is an interesting one, where I think it's a case of, if you believe Haaland is amazing, and he is, or you believe Kane is amazing, like, you can still go for these players, and you won't feel too bad, because Champions League Fantasy also rewards talismans, right? Man of the match is a very huge element of getting FPL points, or not FPL points, sorry, just too used to it, but UCL Fantasy points, right? So if you can almost pick that one key player for the team, that's a tremendous sort of upside. That's worth an assist. So something to think about when I think about teams like Real Madrid and City this season. I feel like Haaland and Mbappe are so obviously the main men within those teams, even though, for example, let's say Arda Güler has been incredible for Real Madrid, or, you know, with City, maybe Foden can occasionally pop up and have a great game. But it's so likely right now, as it stands, for, I think, those 2 players to get man of the match. Maybe when I look at Bayern Munich, it's a little bit more mixed. It could be Luis Diaz. It could be Olise now. With PSG, they're lacking a few players. So something to think about at this point in time. And so let's just jump into my team selection. So as it stands, I am planning to simply just go with triple Real Madrid. And a lot of people think this is crazy. Sure, it is crazy, but I think there has been a pretty big change in terms of, first of all, I see Vinicius completely as a placeholder for Palmer. I'm also ready and willing to ignore Salah. I don't mind doing that. I also see Haaland as a bit of a placeholder for either moving into Lewandowski or Kane in the future. So I really want to get Haaland in place within my team. So that's why in the front line, I've actually got Haaland, Mbappe, and I've got Luis Suarez. Luis Suarez is a 5 million player in the game, and I think it makes absolutely no sense. We're basically talking about how there's a player right now at 5 million who has the best fixture on Matchday 1, and then ultimately when I compare it to any of the cheap forwards in the game, no one really comes close. I think Sporting's at a decent enough level where you're getting enough consistent attacking returns where you don't really mind this player just being a budget option going forwards. Now with Pedro Goncalves, I think he can be sold in the future, right? So when I think about Pedro Goncalves, he probably can be sold. There's other picks in the game that are quite interesting, right? I think Frankfurt, for example, have a midfielder, I think Kazun, who's actually quite interesting, who's also very, very cheap. You've got Xavi Simons at Spurs, who's actually at 6.5 million, which is basically also a ludicrous price point. But Pedro Goncalves at 6 million for me is worth it just on the Matchday 1 punt alone. And I don't really mind shifting him off in the future to someone else, with 2 free transfers. With Olise, I think he's just a lock for the long term, because at 8 million, I think he's actually underpriced. We're basically talking about, I think, Bayern's second most important player at a very cheap price. And even though it is Chelsea at home in Matchday 1, this is going to be a long-term play, right? So I don't feel so bad about getting Olise for the next few fixtures, which would be PAF and then Bruges and then also PSG after that, and it gets a bit tougher, right? But then we're also, as I said, planning to do a limitless in Matchday 5 when they actually play versus Arsenal. Vinicius, as I said, is either going to be someone that I keep for Matchday 1 to 3, or just going to be a Palmer placeholder. And partly, I think the reason why you want to consider going for Vinicius is this is a player moving from the forward position to the midfield position. As a Real Madrid fan, I can tell you this season, Vinicius is not going to get the same amount of minutes he got under Carlo Ancelotti. And neither is he even close to being, I think he's actually the third best player for Real Madrid right now. I think Arda Güler might actually be the second most important player in the team. He's getting a lot of minutes, and part of this is because Jude is still out, but really there's not too many players occupying his minutes. Compared to last year when Rodrigo was actually playing a lot of minutes on the right wing, I don't think Xabi Alonso is going to do that again. Rodrigo right now is pure left wing depth for Vinicius Jr. So I would take the chance with Marseille at home to go for Vinicius Jr. and then see him as a future transfer to Palmer. With Rafinha, for me, he's an absolute lock. Yamal is out, so I don't really like Yamal for match day 1. I don't think he's going to make it towards this Newcastle game. I think Lewandowski is clearly still not in peak fitness, so he's also not going to play enough minutes within Champions League football, whereas Rafinha has almost gotten his rest by virtue of playing the Brazilian international fixtures and then actually getting 45 minutes versus Valencia, where he actually scored a brace in around 20 minutes of play. As far as, you know, long-term plans, right? As I said, Goncalves and Vinicius Jr. definitely can be transfers out. I think Palmer makes a lot of sense, almost too much sense. And there's other Chelsea mids who I think are very interesting to move into at the same time. And I've already mentioned Xavi Simons and even, let's say, maybe a Mohamed Kudus as well at 7 million, who would be quite interesting as future transfers out if I don't want to go for Palmer, for example, because maybe it still could be the case that he's getting his minutes managed with whatever injury he's having. In defense, though, I've gone with the very, very sort of center back dense defense. And part of this, I think, is Otamendi is an amazing set piece threat. He's also someone historically who's been really good at ball recovery, so I really, really do like Otamendi. I think he outscored Antonio Silva by around 20 points last season, so it just shows you, even though he was 36 years old, now 37, how interesting he can be. If you guys remember, even the Club World Cup Fantasy, this guy was an absolute demon in set pieces. Goncalves Inácio has, I think, already racked up 2 assists in the Portuguese league this year. He is quite nailed because Diomande is still out. And I'm basically just banking in, once again, in this match day 1 fixture. Both of these players, I don't think, have great games after match day 1. But for me, the upside of match day 1 actually almost counterbalances the need to transfer them out in the short term, right? So I'm almost saying that a center back at 4.5 million or 5 million isn't going to hurt my team too much because they still have decent expectations going forwards. They can also rack up a lot of ball recovery points. And the UCL system allows you to auto sub players, right? So you don't necessarily need a player that you think, I have to have this player succeed in this week. Or I'm in trouble. In fact, you can almost do the opposite, where why not get as much value as possible at the start and then consider phasing some of these players out over time. The players that I'm not doing that with, though, are the other 3 defenders that I have. So Upamecano, long-term pick for me. Gabriel, long-term pick for me. Dumfries, I think, is just a better attacker than Hakimi just based on the fixtures alone. I might actually be too low on Inter Milan players, and maybe my team by the deadline could have maybe one more Inter Milan player, but I think the value that I'm sort of looking at here is Inter Milan actually have, for me, the tougher game in match day 1, and then actually it gets so good to a freakish extent where maybe actually some of my future transfers as well could be directed to them. I don't really love the midfielders too much, so I think the way to target Inter Milan is clearly within the forwards, where there's value from Thuram, where there's value from Lautaro Martinez, but at the same time, I think there's also a bit of mixed goal share there. There's a bit of a mixed man of the match share there as well. So I just like Dumfries as an outright attacker and someone who ultimately just benefits from those the clean sheet share of the team. So I'm going with them. And in my goalkeeping spots, I'm actually going with Di Gregorio and Joan Garcia. Joan Garcia is a problem in the sense that he could block triple Barcelona down the line, but he's not a problem in the sense that he's a 4.5 Barcelona goalkeeper. Now, Barcelona is clearly, one of the most offensive teams in the world and probably one of the worst defensive teams compared to the level of quality that we think Barcelona are. So they're not exactly a great team to target from defense, but I think at 4.5, I will still take my chances for Joan Garcia, who is also just ultimately a really good shot stopper. So I guess if Barcelona is going to put him to the test like he was put into the test versus Espanyol, I'll take my chances. Di Gregorio actually, I think, is the flip side of that, right? Where at 4.5, I think he's the biggest steal outside of Meret, who is unfortunately injured. So I would say Di Gregorio is probably the most interesting pick. Do Juventus have amazing fixtures? I would say absolutely not. It's BVB at home, Villarreal, then Real Madrid, and then it actually gets really, really good. So to me, right, with someone who's planning to a little bit more of a, I guess, longer-ish term play with a kind of limitless match day 5 in mind, and then maybe also a wildcard 7, I'm almost just factoring, excluding 5, what are the fixtures? I think Di Gregorio is still one of the better picks at 4.5 million. I don't think you can go massively wrong with him. Now, if you want to go for a 4 million goalkeeper, I think we have the Copenhagen goalkeeper as well. The VRL goalkeeper as well is going to be available to you all. But as I said, I will take my chances with Di Gregorio. I have also thought about actually spending, doing that thing that I exactly mentioned, which is basically 4 million plus 4.5 million goalkeepers, and then actually saving 0.5 million, because actually my future transfer, in my opinion, is most likely going to be Pedro Goncalves out and maybe Vinicius out. Vinicius out is a little bit of a temperamental pick. It could actually be Pedro Goncalves out, maybe Otamendi out in the future, just because he's actually somewhere I can see almost the value being displaced elsewhere quite nicely. But if I can get 0.5 billion to upgrade Pedro Goncalves in the future, to me, the easy and obvious pick is going to be not Pedro Goncalves, but obviously Xavi Simons. So I think that's probably the most interesting sort of direction of travel. At the same time, as I said, Otamendi could be a cash cow. Haaland as well could be a cash cow if I don't think he's really worth the sort of price point that I'm holding. And maybe, let's say, I want to move that 10.5 million potentially into, let's say, the midfield position. So that's something I'm considering right now. But this is the team. As I said, going back to almost, let's say, that sort of match day one level graphic, right? If we just think about the team that we have, triple sporting for me is just something that I'm going to take my chances on. If you guys remember going back to that sort of initial visual as well, where do you see a team getting 3.12, for example, goals? You don't really see that up until, let's say, Inter in match day 4, or even Real Madrid in match day 2, where I'm already extremely invested into match day 2 Real Madrid, right? I'm there and I'm ready. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with Sporting, where I'd say I don't mind taking that risk, because really the first game week where I see, okay, maybe I should just bin off these Sporting players, is just going to be a match day 4. And so I have the opportunity in match day 4 to suddenly re-emphasize, for example, a couple of things within the team, maybe actually just even move them towards some Tottenham players, right? Because match day 3 isn't a particularly good Tottenham game. It's a good opportunity rather instead to actually move towards a match day 4 Tottenham sort of move. So going back to match day 1, lots of clean sheets on the table here with Benfica, with Sporting. Bayern Munich a little bit lower, so not the greatest. I'm almost begging for ball recoveries here with Upamecano. Obviously, they're against Chelsea, which is a tough match. Real Madrid, I actually think that, Houston is the best Real Madrid defender to go for at 4.5 million. I think he's actually a bit of a no-brainer, but I've decided to go triple Real Madrid anyways on attack, right? You could also go Alvaro Carrera, so I think it's just incredible. Carvajal and Trent are going to continue dueling for minutes. To me, there's no reason to spend money on Eder Militao, so I would go for either the two. When I look at Bayern Munich, maybe you can consider Stanisic as well, but as I said, I quite like Upamecano for the ball recoveries. I think that can work out quite nicely. As far as, let's say, Liverpool, I mean, you've got your tried and trusted Van Dijk. Even Konate will have to play the Champions League matches, so that's a huge plus for someone like him. I'm not sure if this is the season for me to really be into Salah, so I'm going to be Salah-less for now. With City, for me, I almost only see it as just a team that I'd probably target via Haaland, no one else. And that's pretty much my sort of takeaway. Barcelona's interesting. Tottenham's interesting as well. There's a couple players there, right? For me, it's Rafinha just because of the Yamal injury. Pedri's interesting, but that's almost begging for man of the matches, which I don't think he's necessarily always guaranteed to get. There's just so much sort of different things going on. Even though Pedri's like the hub of the team, the life of the team, really, that's your route towards points, right? Not necessarily too much goal threat, not necessarily too much assist threat. Frankfurt, as I mentioned, is interesting. The Kazun pick in midfield is nice. I don't think I would touch Prague. Tottenham, I've mentioned Kudus, Simons. I don't think I'd go Richarlison, to be honest, but maybe if you're doing a wildcard too, it could make sense. Defense, I think, is exactly where you want to actually be looking at Tottenham. I think their clean sheet odds could actually be a little bit higher. That would be my one point of view. And I've spoken to Shannon about this. I think that with models, I completely understand why you'd underrate Tottenham, right? When you look at, let's say, their underlying stats last season, you can completely understand why they're doing poorly. But this is for me a new season under Frank. We've already seen early doors. They're able to get clean sheets. They're also able to actually utilize their defenders to be able to get set piece goals. Xavi Simons and Kudus are great for that, right? These are set piece takers that weren't there within the team last year. And honestly, I felt like I was watching Arsenal last week when I was watching Tottenham play versus West Ham, or maybe that's just because they were playing West Ham, where Chelsea also did the same thing to them. So yeah, maybe that's just a West Ham thing. But Tottenham are interesting. Romero's there, Van de Ven's there. Decent price points if you're kind of inferring ball recoveries as well. I probably wouldn't touch Porro. Inter Milan, I think you've got so many good picks there. Akanji, if you think he's ready to play and actually start consistent games, I think he's class. He's always been good at ball recoveries. If you guys remember, the Euro Fantasy was Switzerland. Bastoni's a little bit expensive, and I almost think at that sort of price point, why not push towards Dumfries with the attacking threat as well? So that's kind of what I've done. Juventus, I've kind of covered with Di Gregorio. I think Bremer is quite interesting if you want for ball recoveries, or even Gatti to save some money. Leverkusen's not that high, but then you have someone like Grimaldo who could be an absolute ace in the hole, as he was last season as well. Now he's almost on all set pieces for this team, so he can actually be just almost like a one-man attack, right? And Newcastle, I think from the attacking point of view, could be quite interesting, but Barcelona will give you chances. I think that's one pro. When you play versus Barcelona, you can score versus them. They almost are asking for it. They're just saying that they can score more. So it's a case of looking at a team like maybe a player like Anthony Gordon, right, who's definitely fit and ready to play 90 minutes for Newcastle. With Arsenal, for me, that's only a team that I've really touched within the clean sheets, even though punts like Madueke and Eze are quite interesting given the injuries that Arsenal have in play. So that's kind of my review of Matchday 1. As I said, this is going to be my Matchday 1 team. Pretty happy with it. I might make a few changes. I'll let you guys know in terms of Twitter, but best of luck with Champions League Fantasy this season. And let me know what you guys want to see in terms of, going forwards. Do you want to see more content or not? Take care. Goodbye. I'll see you soon.